I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, dairy advisor John McCabe gives advice on the target breeding season length for spring calving dairy herds and first outlines the profile of calvings.
So I suppose over the last 2 years, Emma-Louise, there's been between 1.4 and 1.5 million dairy cows have calved. That's on average. So about 390,000 of them have calved in April, May or June. So that's in around 27% of the national herd are calving in these months. I suppose ideally no more than 10% of these cows should calve in April and none in May or June.
I guess, John, that's very much in line with the targets that we set. Things like our 90% 6-week in-calf rate, on your standard farm, that would account for the majority of your cows calving in the month of February and March. And as you say, there's a target there of 10% or less cows would calve in April. Looking at breeding season length, that has a huge impact in terms of the profile of how we calve. Can you give us a recommendation in terms of breeding season length for spring calving dairy herds?
So the advice for breeding season length is to keep it to about 12 weeks. So that means if you started breeding on the 27th of April, you will have 12 weeks breeding done on Monday, the 20th of July. And a cow served on Monday, the 20th of July, will calve around the 29th of April next year. So if she's served on the 20th of July, she's turning into a late calver at this stage. Ideally, we'd have 70% calving in February, 20% calving in March, and 10% in April. But there are always these stragglers that calve in late April and in May, and the odd one in June. So ideally, I suppose the job of work is to try and get less of these cows calving in May and June.
And considering those cows, you mentioned the word stragglers, and that's often referred to these cows that are calving in late spring and into the summer months. What are the consequences of these later calvers in spring herds?
Okay, yeah. So there are a few consequences. I suppose the main one that is talked about is the extra cost of milking these cows. So compared to a February calver, an April calver will cost you about €150 more to milk than a February calver. A May calver will cost you €220 more, and it's nearly €300 more for a June calver. And these costs, they come in the form of extra silage, extra meal, and extra overhead costs like using the bulk tank or the milking machine. But I think, Emma-Louise, we can talk about feed costs all day, but ultimately I don't think the majority of people who are calving larger than desired percentages of their cows in the April to June period are too concerned about the cost of calving the cow in that period, because they can't directly see that money. But what they can directly see is the potential bank balance if they didn't milk them on through the winter. So people with lots of these later calvers actually sell a lot of their milk throughout the winter because they have to. And if the farmer is not milking over the winter, i.e. if they have a dry off date around the start or the middle of December, then there is a lot of milk lost out by calving the cow in May or June. This loss, I suppose, it's added to the costs I've already mentioned. So the economics of these cows is fairly easy to work out.
And aside from the additional feed costs that you mentioned, milking cows throughout the winter, and also then a reduced milk production if farmers do have a strict dry-off date, maybe at the end of December, are there any other factors or consequences of later calvers on farm?
So I suppose I can comment from attending discussion groups and what farmers say to me, Emma-Louise, and a lot of people say that milking cows on cubicles is a kind of a dirty job, and you can end up with cell count issues. But there's also the labour factor. So like you're turning on the milking machine and the bulk tank and milking cows throughout the winter. I suppose a lot of farmers enjoy having a break between calving and breeding. So even if that's a Saturday or a Sunday evening, milking off for a weekend or two before you start breeding, it's good. It's a good break for the body and the mind. a large proportion of farmers I talk to don't take any milkings off from the start of February until the bulls go in June. So if there are no cows calving from mid-April on, it makes things simpler. By mid to late April, like if you had very few or no cows in the herd that have antibiotics or the danger of failing a bulk tank, if they were milked in, then it's simpler and there's less risk, and you're probably more likely to hand over a bit of control to a relief milker or a family member to give you a break in that period. I suppose what they also say is that rather than focusing on calving cows, you can turn your full attention to preparing the herd for the breeding season. I suppose a couple of the other things that people say to me is that replacement heifer calves that are born on the farm after St. Patrick's Day are harder to get up to the desired weights for breeding. For example, like if we have a calf born on the 1st of April versus a calf born on the 1st of May, the April calf has 30 days less days to reach target weights. So if they don't reach their weights, this can have an effect on lifetime fertility and milk production, and thus the cycle continues, I suppose. Another point is that some of the farmers that are achieving the high 6-week calving rates and with not many late calvers, they say that you should just get the help in place, just make the decision and pay for the help. Now, obviously, short-term help can be more difficult to find on dairy farms, but I suppose the fact that it is said by others that it is difficult to find shouldn't be a crutch to lean on when talking about trying to hire help. Maybe using the likes of your agencies to source help. There are new online apps to match up farmers looking for help and potential workers looking for work. And other potential places to find help are the advert websites and through word of mouth.
I think you've hit on a lot of key points there, John, and I suppose just to re-emphasise the labour point, because you've looked, breeding is something that's happening now, but it has an impact across the full year. And if we think about it, you mentioned getting that compact 6-week calving rate, and in reality a cow that calves in the first 6 weeks will achieve up to 290 to 300 days in milk by the 20th of December, and that is often the desired dry off date. So you're not milking cows through the Christmas period. And I think you've highlighted that there can be a labour challenge on farms during the calving period, but where it's compact, that I suppose busy calving period where it's all hands on deck, that is confined to a much shorter period of time.
If you have the dry off period there, you're giving yourself a break there over the Christmas and January months, to give yourself a break to rejuvenate before you start calving. I suppose there's a job of work to be done to highlight the importance and at the end of the day, the extra profit to be gained from calving cows more compactly. I've been setting down a new challenge to some of my discussion groups, and that is to have 90% of the herd eligible to milk into the tank for St. Patrick's Day. So I suppose if you're on a heavy soil or up in the border, Midlands or Western region, you could set that target a week later. But I suppose it kind of focuses the mind a bit more to the task at hand, which is selling plenty of milk from every cow and cheaply and off grass. So I suppose my new target is to have 90% of the herd milking into the tank for Paddy's Day.
And looking to the breeding season, a lot of people will have started breeding anywhere from the 25th of April to the 1st of May. And as you say, in reality, that will mean that this week they're hitting 12 weeks of breeding. Where a farmer would traditionally maybe have bred for 14, 15 weeks, and, we're looking at the target and the recommendation is pulling that back to 12 weeks. If people make that jump and pull back their breeding season by maybe even 1 week this year, like what, taking that decision to remove the bull or cease AI this week, what will people see in terms of, I suppose, the consequences of that, finishing that breeding season early?
If a farmer who has a spread out calving pattern decides to finish his or her breeding season after 12 weeks, the likelihood of having a high empty rate is quite high. So these farmers need to make a plan to deal with this heifers should be in place or bought in from a herd with low risk of disease to replace these empty cows. And it may be a case in a very small percentage of cases where the farmer has ample facilities, a low stocking rate, surplus winter fodder, and where it won't add too much time to the day's work, that they could leave the bull in and winter the cows and sell them as late calvers. But I'm not a fan of this approach for a few reasons. It means the temptation is there to keep them in the herd when they do calve down the following year. And from my experience, this temptation seems to be very strong. Or in other words, in a lot of cases, these aren't sold. So another couple of reasons would be that if fodder supplies run short due to weather events, then you could be exposed to unnecessary risk. We just need to think back to 2018 for that. And if you're selling them on as late calvers, someone else is going to calve them, which is not solving the problem nationally. And another thing to take into consideration probably would be that if you got locked up with TB, you could be stuck with them. I know, Emma-Louise, this podcast is focusing on late calvers, but I'm of the opinion that if there's a problem with lots of April, May and June calvers, we need to know why they are turning up late. Like, is the submission rate not high enough, or is there another problem? So, like, is it a genetic problem? Is it a metabolic problem in the spring? Is it a heifer weight issue, as we've mentioned already? Is it a practical problem with breeding? Like, so if it's a genetic problem that we're having a lot of these late calvers, I think we need to aim for a higher fertility sub-index in the cows. I'm always keeping an eye on the elite cows in the next generation herd at Moor Park, and their fertility sub-index is averaging over €100. If it's a metabolic problem, like do we have lots of milk fevers in the spring or other issues? So do we need to investigate how we feed the herd over the winter and spring? Do we need to test the silage for DMD and minerals, like in particular, I suppose high K, as we're trying to increase our soil indexes these days? On the heifer weights, like, if you're calving a lot of your cows in March, April, May, and if you're calving some replacement, if some of them are going to be replacements, some of them calves calved in April and May are going to be replacements. It's going to be hard to get them up to the target weights, like as we talked about already, and we have to find out if it's a practical problem. So is the breeding of heifers difficult or time consuming? If the heifers are away, consider bringing them home to the milking platform for synchronized AI. This is better than running them with a bull and having a stretched out calving pattern of first calvers, because it'll be very hard to get a March or an April first calver back into February and March. So I suppose bringing the heifers home for 5 or 6 days to do a fixed time protocol, or for 2 weeks with a prostaglandin program, this won't put too much pressure on grass growth either, because you're reaching peak growth at that time. And I suppose the main point I would say is on late calvers is late calvers, they generally stay late calvers, and we can throw the kitchen sink at them in April and May to try and get them back into February and March, but we need to try and sort the problem.
I suppose, John, you've highlighted a number of key issues, and as you say, it's not just confined to what you do during the breeding season. There's a huge body of work that farmers need to do, and by and large farmers are doing it very well early on in the season, being very aware of any metabolic diseases, making sure heifers are at target, and also then at the bigger picture stuff in terms of the fertility and the genetics that are are working away in the background in these cows. I think one of the key things that you're talking about is ensuring that all cows are fit for breeding at the start of the breeding season, and that would mean that cows are calved and also have had a defined period where they can resume cyclicity. And ultimately what you're talking about in terms of where you're tightening your calving pattern, you are ultimately going to take a hit in year 1 or year 2 where you're going to lose those late calvers. But not always necessarily a bad thing, because as you say, if they're a late calver this year, they're invariably going to be a late calver next year, and there's not many exceptions to that rule. I suppose finally, John, if we look at we've pulled the bull or we've ceased AI, a comment that we get from a lot of farmers is, God, my best cow is after cycling. She's after coming cycling today. What do you do with that cow?
Yeah, and this comes up at discussion groups plenty, Emma-Louise. I think if she's your best cow and she comes cycling after the 20th of July, I don't think she's your best cow at all. So it'd be better to have a February or March calving cow. I suppose just to summarise, I think the transition needs to be planned out, and that is pulling the bull on time, or in other words, Monday the 20th of July. If we have the facilities, continue to milk on these late calvers throughout the winter because you can't afford not to. Sell them as empties out of the parlour in February or March for €900 rather than taking 400 quid for them as empties in December. Yes, they'll have eaten silages and meals and taken up other costs, but we will have either put milk in the tank or condition up on their backs, and we'll have made a plan for drying off the following year. Without as many late calvers, hopefully. So then you need to replace these empty cows with early calving, high EBI, high fertility heifers. And when that is done, sit down, figure out why do you have the late calvers in the first place, so that that problem can be sorted in the years ahead, and that you don't end up back at square one in a few years' time with the current February and March calvers drifting into April and May.
Thank you, John.
No problem, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of The Dairy Edge, and my thanks to John McCabe for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.